Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, a conflict between the northern states, the Union, and the southern states, the Confederacy, that seceded over the issue of slavery. The North was industrialized and opposed the spread of slavery, while the South's economy relied heavily on slave labor, especially for growing cotton. Tensions had been building for decades, and the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed slavery's expansion, triggered the southern states to leave the Union. The war began in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Major battles like Gettysburg and Antietam caused huge casualties. Over 600,000 soldiers died in total. Initially, the North thought to preserve the Union, but in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, making the war a fight to end slavery. The war ended in 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Union was saved, slavery was abolished, but the country faced the difficult process of Reconstruction to rebuild and grant rights to freed slaves. But before we continue, I'm always curious, where are you listening from? What time is it for you? Are you getting ready to sleep, or maybe out driving late, or just trying to kill time with my stories? Let me know in the comments. And now, let's begin. The gunsmoke still lingered over Charleston Harbor as the echoes of cannon fire faded into the wet spring air. April 12, 1861. The first shots at Fort Sumter had been fired. It was early morning, but history doesn't wait for daylight. In those thunderous blasts, the last threads holding North and South together were finally torn apart. And somewhere, in the quiet between volleys, a nation held its breath. The Civil War had begun. But no war ever starts with a cannon. That sound was only the climax of decades of strain, of deals brokered in back rooms, of shouted debates echoing through the marble halls of Congress, of blood spilled in border towns where neighbors became enemies. And tonight we drift back through those years before the war, to understand how a country built on liberty found itself consumed by conflict. For much of the 19th century, the United States was a nation growing outward, expanding westward like a tide. With every new territory added, however, came a question that poisoned the optimism of expansion. Would slavery be allowed there? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first attempt to bottle the storm. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free one, and the invisible line of latitude at 36.30 degrees would divide the country's future. But lines on maps can't erase moral fault lines. By the 1850s, that compromise was showing cracks. The Compromise of 1850 tried again. California would enter the Union as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act would be strengthened, forcing northern citizens to return escaped slaves or face punishment. Imagine for a moment living in Boston or Philadelphia and being compelled by law to hand over a man fleeing bondage. The North bristled, the South demanded obedience, and the center held a little less each day. Then came Kansas, a name that today might not stir much emotion, but in 1854 it became a flashpoint. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers in those territories to vote on whether to allow slavery, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise. Popular sovereignty, they called it, but it was anything but popular. As pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, violence erupted. Towns were burned. People were killed. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. It was a preview of the war to come. But somehow, many still hoped the Union could hold. Meanwhile, in courtrooms and on plantations, the lives of enslaved men and women were traded like coin. And then, in 1857, the Supreme Court delivered a decision that would push America closer to the brink. Dred Scott, a black man who had lived in free territory, sued for his freedom. The court ruled not only that he remained a slave, but that black people, free or enslaved, could never be citizens of the United States. It was a devastating blow to abolitionists and a victory for Southern slaveholders. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney wrote that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. It wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a declaration. Tensions now surged from Washington to every dirt road in the countryside. I often think about what it must have felt like, walking down a quiet street in a divided town. Maybe you'd pass your neighbor, and neither of you would know which side the other stood on. Maybe you were in a border state, Kentucky, Missouri, and heard rumors of militias forming. Or maybe you read the papers and saw the rise of a tall, strange-looking lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. He didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states, but when he won the presidency in 1860, it was the final straw for many in the South. But that part, Lincoln's rise, the secession, the collapse of unity, that comes just after this. For now, here in these years before war, we're in a country in turmoil, yet still desperately clinging to the idea that compromise can somehow still save it. The political chessboard was crowded. Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser, had tried again and again to keep the peace. Daniel Webster had thundered from the Senate floor for unity. John C. Calhoun had argued, with fire in his eyes, that the South's way of life was non-negotiable. But these men were dying off, one by one, and the next generation didn't speak the same careful language of balance. They were louder, angrier, and more willing to risk it all. And then there were the people in the shadows of these grand debates, enslaved families escaping through the Underground Railroad, aided by strangers who risked prison to help them. Harriet Tubman made 13 missions, guiding more than 70 people to freedom, her revolver at her side and a quiet fierceness in her step. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved himself, stood behind podiums and declared, "The life of the nation is secure only while the nation is honest." It's easy to imagine history as a series of grand events, but it's made in whispers, in choices, in silent prayers before dawn. And by the late 1850s, you could feel something building, like the way the air thickens before a storm. You could feel it in church sermons, in tavern arguments, in editorials printed in ink still smelling of the press. You could feel it in the silence between neighbors who no longer trusted one another. One story that lingers with me is from a small town in Virginia. A man named Thomas, a free black carpenter, had built homes all across the area. He was respected until rumors began to spread that he had helped slaves escape. One night, a mob gathered. They didn't knock. They set fire to his shop, and he barely escaped with his life. That story never made the national news, but it happened, and it speaks volumes. So many believed, or hoped, the crisis could be solved politically. But the truth is, the American system had created an impossible contradiction. A nation founded on liberty that allowed slavery to exist. Eventually, that contradiction had to break, and it would break in fire. The storm was coming, and the men in power knew it. When Senator William H. Seward spoke of an irrepressible conflict between freedom and slavery, he was called a radical. But maybe he simply saw what was already written on the wall. And so, as we leave this moment in time, standing at the edge of war, still clinging to the last threads of peace, we begin to understand why compromise could no longer hold. The Union was cracking. The people were choosing sides. And history, as it often does, was about to speak in cannon fire. It's the winter of 1860, and in the quiet chill that settles over the southern countryside, something heavier than frost begins to spread. Fear. Not the kind that strikes like lightning, but the kind that creeps, slow, suffocating, undeniable. Lincoln has been elected, and for many in the South, that single event is more than political. It feels like the beginning of the end. In South Carolina, the atmosphere turns electric. Charleston's newspapers are thick with bold words like separation, rights, and sovereignty. There's no waiting for Lincoln to even take office. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union. The decision is unanimous. One delegate would later write that it was a solemn act, but one that must be done. The ripple becomes a wave. Within 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas follow. By February of 1861, 7 southern states have broken away from the United States to form their own nation, the Confederate States of America. They gather in Montgomery, Alabama, to write a constitution. It's eerily similar to the US Constitution, but with one crucial difference. It explicitly protects slavery. It's not hidden, not couched in legal ambiguity. Slavery is the foundation of their new country. Jefferson Davis, a former US Senator from Mississippi and Secretary of War, is chosen as the Confederate president. He accepts the role with a reluctant sense of duty. Davis was not the fiery secessionist some might imagine. He had once hoped for reconciliation, but he also believed deeply in states' rights and in the Southern cause. In his inaugural address, he speaks of peace, but prepares for war. Back in Washington, panic is growing. President Buchanan is still in office, but he does little to stop the unraveling. He believes the Constitution gives him no power to coerce states back into the Union. Congress, too, is paralyzed, caught between compromise and crisis. When Abraham Lincoln finally takes the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the country is already broken. His speech is calm, measured, almost pleading. He tells the South he has no intention to abolish slavery where it already exists. He urges unity, reminding Americans that they are not enemies but friends. The mystic cords of memory, he says, stretching from every battlefield and patrioned grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. It's a beautiful line. But history will not be swayed by poetry alone. Tensions move from words to action. Federal forts in the South are now surrounded by Confederate forces. The most volatile is Fort Sumter, a lonely brick fortress on a man-made island guarding the Charleston harbor. It's still held by Union troops under the command of Major Robert Anderson, but they're running out of supplies. In early April, Lincoln sends word that a relief expedition is on the way, carrying food, no weapons, no reinforcements. But for the Confederacy, this is intolerable. Allowing the resupply would make them look weak, as if the Union still held sovereignty over their territory. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries open fire. The skies above Charleston light up with the flashes of cannon. The bombardment continues for 34 straight hours. Smoke hangs in the salt air. Windows shake in the city. Crowds gather on rooftops to watch as if it's a strange theater, not yet understanding that what they're witnessing is the start of something catastrophic. The Union forces, outgunned and surrounded, eventually surrender the fort. Miraculously, no one is killed during the shelling. But the bloodless opening does not foreshadow a gentle war. When news reaches the North, the reaction is immediate and visceral. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The South sees this not as law enforcement, but as tyranny. In response, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, join the Confederacy. The Union is not just divided by geography. It's divided by ideology, by economy, by the deepest currents of history. What had been smoldering for decades has now burst into open flame. A man named Sam Watkins, a young Confederate soldier from Tennessee, would later write in his memoirs, "We were ignorant of the world and its ways. We knew nothing of war and cared less. We thought it would be a picnic, a frolic, a summer outing that would be over in a month." But that month lasted 4 years. You can almost hear the regret in his words, years later. How many boys signed up thinking the same? That it would be a quick fight, a proud charge, a moment of glory. That they'd come back heroes, their uniforms barely stained. No one, North or South, truly grasped what was coming. And as the first shots echoed over the Atlantic tidewaters, they didn't just hit bricks and ramparts. They shattered any illusion that this union, once held together by compromise and shared revolution, could be saved without war. There's something deeply tragic about this moment. The train had left the station long ago, but now it's barreling downhill. No brakes, no conductor who can stop it. And in its path, cities, families, ideals, lives. From here, we begin to see the outlines of something monstrous. 2 nations now stare each other down across rivers and borders. They speak the same language, sing many of the same hymns, and read from the same Bible, but they are preparing to kill one another.
War has arrived.
And with it, all the unknowns that still wait in the silence before the storm. Let's keep walking through it, slowly, carefully, together. In the next part, we'll follow the first real clashes of this war, the early battles where brothers, sometimes literally, face one another across fields turned into graveyards. We'll meet the generals, the tactics, and the men who thought they were marching to quick victory, but found themselves trapped in something far darker. But for now, let that thought settle quietly. The Union has fractured. The guns have fired. The road ahead is blood-stained and long, and the story is only just beginning. The drums of war had sounded, and with Fort Sumter reduced to rubble, the United States was no longer a country at odds with itself. It was a country at war with itself. In the early months that followed, the mood on both sides of the divide was strangely confident. Many believed it would all be over in a matter of weeks. Young men, some barely old enough to shave, rushed to enlist. They marched through cheering towns with polished buttons and brass bands leading the way. Newspapers in the north predicted a swift end, a few decisive battles, and the rebellion would be crushed. In the south, talk of independence and honor stirred deep pride. They believed one southern man could best any 10 northerners, and that Cotton would be king in any war of endurance. But war, as it so often does, had other plans. The first great shock came in July of 1861, at a little stream in Virginia called Bull Run, known as Manassas by the Confederates. It was the first major land battle of the war, and for many, it was a brutal wake-up call. Thousands of civilians from Washington had made the short trip out with picnic baskets and spyglasses, expecting a spectacle, a quick and easy victory. What they witnessed instead was panic and blood. Union troops, green and disorganized, collapsed under a fierce Confederate counterattack led by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, whose cool resolve under fire earned him his nickname that day. The Union line broke, soldiers fled, spectators were caught in the stampede. Reality had arrived. Both sides now saw that this would not be a neat or noble affair. It would be long, hard, and costly. And as the war deepened, so did its cruelty. In the West, the conflict took on a different shape. Rivers were highways, and towns like Fort Donelson and Fort Henry became prizes in a struggle for control. A relatively unknown Union general named Ulysses S. Grant began to rise through the ranks with quiet determination. Grant was not flashy. He didn't make speeches. He simply fought and won. After capturing both forts in early 1862, he pushed deeper into Confederate territory. Then came Shiloh. It was April. The air was warm, the trees were budding, and near a small church in Tennessee, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in just 2 days. The name Shiloh means place of peace, but what happened there was anything but. Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack, nearly routing Grant's army on the first day. Johnston himself was killed, bled out silently after being shot in the leg, unaware the wound was fatal. But Grant did not retreat. Reinforcements arrived overnight, and the Union pushed back with a ferocity that stunned the South. The battle ended in Union victory, but at a staggering cost. Americans were beginning to understand what total war would look like. One private wrote home, "The dead were lying so thick you could walk on them for yards and not touch the ground." Out east, leadership was proving a thorny issue for the Union. General George McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac, was brilliant in planning but hesitant in action. President Lincoln grew frustrated with his unwillingness to move decisively. "If General McClellan does not want to use the army," Lincoln quipped, "I would like to borrow it for a while." Still, McClellan's army was vast, well-trained, and beloved by his men. He launched the Peninsula Campaign in spring 1862, aiming to seize Richmond by moving up the Virginia Peninsula. But Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly in command after Joseph E. Johnston was wounded, proved a master of maneuver and misdirection. He launched a series of bold attacks known as the 7 Days Battles, driving McClellan's army away from the Confederate capital. Lee had quickly become the South's greatest hope. A graduate of West Point, and a veteran of the Mexican-American War, Lee was graceful, daring, and deeply respected. But he also carried a burden, a loyalty to Virginia that had led him to side with the Confederacy, despite his own reservations about secession. In September of that same year, Lee took the war north into Maryland, hoping a victory on Union soil might sway European powers and break Northern morale. But his plans were discovered, literally. A Union soldier found a copy of his marching orders wrapped around cigars left behind in a field. What followed was the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history. Over 22,000 casualties in a matter of hours. The sun rose over cornfields that would be soaked with blood by noon. Burnside's Bridge, the Bloody Lane, the Dunkard Church, names that would become etched in the country's memory. Neither side won a clear victory, but Lee's invasion was halted, and that was enough. Lincoln used the moment to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, shifting the war's purpose toward freedom. But that comes later in our story. What's important now is to pause and recognize what the early years of the war had become. Not a clash of ideals on paper, but a grinding, unrelenting machine of death. Over time, strategies evolved. Both sides realized the war would not be won with glorious charges alone. It would be fought with telegraph lines strung across battlefields, with railroads transporting troops and supplies faster than ever before. It would be fought with rifles that could fire farther and faster, and cannons that shattered flesh and bone without warning. It was, in many ways, the first truly modern war. Soldiers wrote home with trembling hands, describing the sound of bullets tearing through trees, the screams of the wounded in field hospitals, the strange quiet that came after a charge when the air was thick with smoke and blood. Doctors sawed through limbs without anesthesia, overwhelmed by the tide of suffering. And yet, through it all, life went on. Letters were written, songs were sung around campfires, chaplains gave sermons beneath stars. There were moments of humanity, enemy soldiers trading tobacco and coffee across lines during lulls and fighting, or burying the dead together in silence. Sometimes I think about those nights, when the guns fell quiet, and both sides lay awake under the same sky, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. In that strange stillness, there was something shared, something deeply human beneath all the uniforms and politics. A longing for home, for peace, for meaning. But peace was still far away. The war was just beginning to twist into something deeper, more personal. It would no longer be just about states' rights or federal power. Soon, it would be about people, millions of enslaved men and women, and whether their chains would finally be broken. The cannons had long since gone silent, but by 1863, the sound of war had become something else entirely. Quieter, somehow, yet heavier, a steady, grinding weight pressing down on both North and South. Soldiers were no longer boys fresh off the farm. The uniforms were worn, the songs fewer, the eyes older. And in the muddy camps where men waited to die, the question began to shift, not just how to win this war, but why they were fighting it at all. This is the year everything changed. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. But it began to stir in the early months, in quiet conversations behind doors in Washington, in the resolute crease of Lincoln's brow as he paced his candlelit study, and in the rising cry of abolitionists who had waited far too long for this war to mean something more than lines on a map. Slavery had always been the shadow at the heart of the conflict, but Lincoln had been cautious. He believed he needed to hold the border states, those like Kentucky and Missouri that still permitted slavery but had not seceded. If he pushed too hard, he feared they'd join the Confederacy. So for the first 2 years, the war was framed as a battle to save the Union, not to end slavery. But by the end of 1862, the cost of that compromise was too high. The moment came after the bloody stalemate at Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day in American history. More than 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single sunrise to sunset inferno. And though tactically inconclusive, it gave Lincoln what he needed, a victory, however narrow, to make a bold move. On September 22, 1862, He issued a preliminary warning. If the rebellious states did not return to the Union by the new year, their slaves would be declared forever free. They didn't. And so, on January 1st, 1863, with his hand trembling slightly as he signed, Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free every enslaved person, only those in Confederate-held territories beyond the reach of Union enforcement at the time. But its symbolism was seismic. The war now had a new moral spine. It was no longer simply a fight for reunification, but a crusade for liberation. And the effect rippled across the Atlantic. Europe, particularly Britain and France, had been watching the conflict with uneasy neutrality. Both nations relied heavily on Southern cotton, and many aristocrats sympathized with the Confederacy. But once the war took on the banner of abolition, public opinion shifted. How could Britain, which had outlawed slavery decades earlier, support a nation founded on its preservation? Historian James McPherson put it simply. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the character of the war. Diplomatically, it sealed the Confederacy's fate. There would be no European intervention. But perhaps more profoundly, it changed the composition of the Union Army. You might not expect it, but nearly 200,000 African American men would serve in the Union ranks before the war's end, most of them formerly enslaved. They joined segregated units, often commanded by white officers, and faced lower pay, harsher discipline, and the constant threat of being executed or re-enslaved if captured by Confederate forces. But still, they came. One of the most famous of these units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Their assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina that July was a doomed mission, but they fought with such determination that even skeptics in the North were moved. Sergeant William Kearny, who took up the Union flag after the color-bearer fell and carried it to the fort's walls, became the first African American to earn the Medal of Honor. "I only did my duty," Kearny later said. The old flag never touched the ground. And back behind enemy lines, where the Emancipation Proclamation couldn't be enforced by troops, enslaved people acted as liberators of themselves. They fled plantations in the dead of night, braving dogs, patrols, rivers, and wilderness. Thousands reached Union lines and found refuge. Others joined the war effort in subtler ways, sabotaging equipment, slowing production, refusing orders, or simply walking away. It's worth pausing here, because in history books, these moments often get reduced to statistics, but each escape was a heartbeat, a story, a mother slipping into the woods with a baby swaddled to her chest, a boy watching the road for Union soldiers, hoping to hear boots that didn't belong to the overseer, a man lifting a shovel at dawn, knowing that by dusk he might be free or dead. And the Confederacy felt the drain. As more and more enslaved workers disappeared or rebelled, the South's economy and war effort began to crack. Cotton fields went unpicked, rail lines went unrepaired. The very foundation of their society, built on the labor of others, was beginning to erode from within. But emancipation came with a backlash too. In the North, not everyone rejoiced. Some feared the influx of freedmen would threaten jobs. Racist mobs erupted in cities like New York, where the 1863 draft riots spiraled into violent attacks on black citizens. It was a grim reminder that the road to justice was jagged, even in the so-called free states. And Lincoln? He faced immense political risk. Critics called him reckless, a tyrant. Newspapers warned of insurrection, but he held firm. In a letter to James Conkling that summer, Lincoln wrote, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." His conviction wasn't born overnight. It was forged in fire, in war, in heartbreak. But by 1863, he had grown into the role history demanded of him, a reluctant emancipator who finally realized that the Union he hoped to preserve had to be worthy of preservation. The proclamation didn't end slavery. That would require a constitutional amendment still 2 years away. But it reshaped the war's soul. It told the world, and more importantly told America, that this fight was about more than territory. It was about people. And that made all the difference. As the year wore on, and the fields of Gettysburg and Vicksburg loomed just ahead, You could feel the war turning. Slowly, painfully, like the shifting of tectonic plates under a sleeping nation. The blood had not stopped, but now it meant something. It was the summer of 1863, and the fields of Pennsylvania were about to become hallowed ground. For 3 days in early July, the rolling hills around the quiet town of Gettysburg bore witness to one of the most ferocious battles ever fought on American soil. Tens of thousands of men converged here, some by fate, others by command. And what unfolded would turn the tide of the Civil War. It began with chance. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had led his army north into Union territory, hoping to relieve pressure on the war-torn South, and perhaps even force the North to sue for peace. Union forces under General George Meade moved to intercept him, and the two armies collided on July 1st, 1863. The fighting was immediate and chaotic, streets filled with smoke and musket fire. Civilians hid in their homes, praying for silence that would not come. On the first day, the Confederates pushed Union troops back through the town, taking the high ground south of Gettysburg. But the Union forces dug in along a long ridge shaped like a fishhook, from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Ridge, and there they prepared for the next blow. The second day brought attacks on the flanks. The names of those places, Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, would be etched forever into the American memory. Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, with his 20th Maine Regiment, famously defended the far left of the Union line in a desperate bayonet charge that likely saved the entire position. He later recalled, in a hushed and haunted voice, how the ground was so thick with bodies that it was hard to walk without stepping on the dead. It was, he said, as though the world had paused to mourn. On the third day came Pickett's charge, perhaps the most infamous single assault of the entire war. Under a blazing sun, 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched across an open field toward the Union center. Lee hoped to break the line and claim victory. What he got instead was devastation. Union cannons rained iron onto the advancing troops, cutting down men by the hundreds. The assault failed. Of those who charged, over half were killed or wounded in less than an hour. After the smoke cleared, the fields were thick with blood and the groans of the dying. More than 51,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and it marked the high watermark of the Confederacy. Lee would never again launch an offensive into the North. Lincoln visited the battlefield 4 months later to dedicate a national cemetery. His speech was short, just 272 words, but they carried a weight that echoed across generations. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He spoke not only to honor the dead, but to remind the living that this war was now about the very soul of the nation. While Gettysburg dominated the Eastern Front, another critical siege was unfolding in the West, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Here, Union General Ulysses S. Grant was determined to gain full control of the Mississippi River, which would split the Confederacy in two. Vicksburg was a fortress city perched high above the river. Confederate troops had dug in, and for weeks, Grant's army laid siege to them. Civilians hid in caves carved into the hillsides to avoid the relentless shelling. Food ran out. People ate rats, dogs, whatever they could find. One woman, writing in her diary by candlelight as bombs fell, simply wrote, "We are being buried alive." On July 4th, 1863, one day after Pickett's failed charge at Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. It was a symbolic and strategic blow. The Confederacy was now cut in half, and Grant had proven himself as a general who would fight and win at any cost. It's strange to think how these two turning points happened nearly simultaneously, as if history itself had decided the war had lingered long enough without direction. From that point on, the momentum was with the Union, but the suffering was far from over. Letters from soldiers during this period often carry a different tone. The excitement of early battles had long since vanished. In its place was exhaustion, grief, and a kind of numbness. One Union soldier wrote to his sister, "I no longer weep when my friends fall. I simply help bury them and move on." I wonder if this war has taken something from me I will never get back. Even civilians were beginning to unravel. Towns became makeshift hospitals, and homes were filled with amputees and fevered groans. For many, especially in the South, the war had turned their world to ash. Entire counties were stripped of men. Children stopped going to school. Plantations fell into ruin. In a rare surviving interview from years later, a Southern woman named Elizabeth Randolph recalled watching her home burn during the Union advance. There were no words to describe it, she said. It wasn't just the house. It was the memories, the hopes. It was everything we thought the world would be. Still, despite the ruin and grief, both sides fought on. Each battle, each death, hardened resolve. There was a strange paradox at play. Every life lost seemed only to feed the need to win, to justify the sacrifice already made. Gettysburg and Vicksburg were not the end, but they were, undeniably, a beginning of the end. From here, the war would take on a new character. The Union, now with the upper hand, began to wage not just war on armies, but war on the Southern will. Cities would burn, railroads would be torn apart, and the cries of war would become louder, even as victory came into view. As we move forward, we'll follow those final, brutal years. The scorched earth of Sherman's march, the tightening grip around Richmond, and the quiet steps that led towards surrender. But for now, we pause on those haunted hills of Gettysburg, where the wheat fields still sway in the wind, and the ghosts of July 1863 linger just beneath the surface. The ground air remembers, even when we forget. Close your eyes if you can, and imagine it. The thunder of cannons, the charge of thousands, the silence after. It was not the end of war, but perhaps it was the beginning of peace, however distant it still seemed. The cold winds of late 1864 swept through Georgia's pine forests and smoky hills, and they carried more than just the chill of winter. They carried the thunder of boots, the crackle of flames, and the groaning collapse of barns and railroads. It was here, beneath the grey sky, that General William Tecumseh Sherman began a new kind of campaign, not aimed at an army, but at a way of life. Sherman had seen enough of the war to know that victory would not come solely from battlefield maneuvers. After years of bloodshed, from Shiloh to Chattanooga, he believed the South would not surrender until its very will to fight had been broken. And so, in November of 1864, he set his plan in motion. To carve a path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah, a campaign remembered simply as the March to the Sea. Now, it wasn't just about defeating soldiers. Sherman aimed to dismantle the Confederacy's very foundation, its farms, its railways, its arsenals, and even its psychology. War is cruelty, he later said, and you cannot refine it. Some called him a monster, others called him a genius. But no one denied the impact of what came next. As Union troops moved out of a smouldering Atlanta, a city already battered by months of siege, they fanned out across the countryside, marching in columns 40 to 60 miles wide. They tore up railroads, melting and twisting the iron rails around trees into eerie shapes that soldiers nicknamed Sherman's neckties. Barns filled with Confederate cotton were put to the torch. Livestock was seized, crops destroyed. Foraging parties, dubbed bummers, swept through plantations and villages, taking food and supplies. But here's what's important to understand. Sherman's strategy wasn't mindless destruction. He issued strict orders against harming civilians, though discipline often frayed at the edges. His goal was to make the South understand that the Confederacy couldn't protect them. "If the people raise a howl against my barbarity and cruelty," he wrote to Grant, "I will answer that war is war and not popularity seeking." The psychological toll of this campaign was devastating. One Georgia woman, Dolly Lunt Burge, kept a diary as the blue-coated soldiers approached her plantation. She described her heartbreak as they took her mules, her grain, even the food off her stove. "They have left me nothing but my land," she wrote. And that was exactly the point. By the time Sherman reached Savannah in December, after a 300-mile scorched trail through Georgia, he sent a telegram to President Lincoln. "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah. It was a moment of triumph, but also of eerie calm. A silent southern city surrendered without a fight. While Sherman marched east, General Grant continued his relentless push toward Richmond, locking horns with Robert E. Lee in a brutal campaign that bled both armies dry. Grant, unlike so many before him, refused to retreat. After the horrendous fighting at the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, he moved southward again and again, keeping pressure on Lee like a vice. By the summer of 1864, Grant had pinned Lee's army outside Petersburg, a vital rail hub just south of Richmond. The siege that followed wasn't a single battle, but a long, slow chokehold, 10 months of trench warfare, exhaustion, and misery. Soldiers lived in mud, infested with lice, trading coffee for tobacco across enemy lines. It was modern war in a primitive time, and it wore down the proud army of Northern Virginia, bit by bit. As winter passed, the South's infrastructure was crumbling. The Confederate dollar was worthless. Railroads lay in twisted heaps. Armies starved. Desertions rose sharply. In Richmond, citizens were boiling shoe leather for soup. President Jefferson Davis was still calling for endurance, but even his closest allies knew the end was creeping closer. As Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens later admitted, "Our cause is lost. It is idle to talk otherwise." Meanwhile, political tides were shifting. Lincoln had feared he'd lose re-election in 1864, especially as casualty numbers soared. But Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September revitalized Northern morale. Lincoln won by a wide margin. And his re-election sent a powerful message to the South. The North was not giving up. That same winter, Lincoln made a quiet journey to Grant's headquarters at City Point, Virginia. He met with generals and walked among the soldiers in muddy boots, shaking hands and offering kind words. They weren't expecting that. One soldier later wrote, "I never saw a man so beloved. He looked so tired, and yet he smiled." End quote. It's those little moments that still haunt the memory of this war. A quiet nod between officers, a shared blanket among strangers, a president watching over the battlefield with sorrow in his eyes. For all the numbers, all the strategies, it was still a deeply human conflict, and its human cost had become unbearable. And yet, the war wasn't quite finished. Not yet. The Confederate army still clung to hope, even as that hope grew thinner by the hour. In the Carolinas, Sherman now turned his army northward, moving toward Columbia, South Carolina, the state that had been the first to secede. The devastation was familiar, but in South Carolina, it carried a sharper edge. Many Union soldiers blamed this state for starting the war, and discipline weakened. When Sherman's army entered Columbia in February of 1865, fires broke out. Whether started by retreating Confederates, looters, or careless soldiers remains debated. But by morning, much of the city was in ashes. In a letter to his wife, Sherman confessed, "Though I cannot accuse myself of wrong, I feel that terrible responsibility. To command is to bear the weight of others' actions. That's what war does. It spreads guilt and sorrow like smoke over a burned field." Meanwhile, Lee was running out of options. Supplies were gone. His troops, ragged and shoeless, were beginning to surrender in pockets. In Richmond, Davis clung to power, but the government was unraveling. In early April, Grant broke through the Petersburg lines, forcing Lee to retreat. Confederate soldiers fled westward, hoping for reinforcements that would never come. Soon, all roads would lead to Appomattox. But that's for another night. This moment, this march across Georgia and through the heart of the Carolinas, it wasn't just military strategy. It was a reckoning. Sherman, Grant, and Lincoln understood something hard and terrible. That to end the war, they had to end the illusion that the Confederacy could ever be whole again. They had to make surrender the only remaining path. And that is how a war that began with cries of glory and quick victory turned into a slow, grinding devastation that consumed everything in its path. But from those ashes, something new was about to rise. The winter of 1865 hung heavy over the South, a season not just of cold, but of silence, the kind that follows thunder. Cities had burned, Rail lines were twisted, scorched like old bones. Farms lay in ruin. And in the east, General Robert E. Lee's army was running out of everything: food, men, time. Richmond, the Confederate capital, trembled on the edge of collapse. And the great gamble of secession, of war, was unraveling with each step of the Union advance. Lee had once seemed invincible. His battlefield instincts were brilliant, his presence near mythic. But now, his forces were trapped in a tightening circle. General Ulysses S. Grant, calm and relentless, had ground away at Lee's army in the Overland Campaign, and then laid siege to Petersburg, Virginia, a crucial rail hub just south of Richmond. That siege lasted more than 9 months, stretching from June 1864 into April 1865, and it bled the Confederacy dry. Soldiers deserted in the night, supplies stopped coming, and even Lee's iron will began to bend. Grant wasn't chasing glory. He didn't write poetry or speeches. He just kept moving forward. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he once said, and he meant it. By spring, his forces numbered over 100,000. Lee had barely half that, many of them hungry, barefoot, boys and old men barely fit for war. On April 2nd, 1865, Union troops finally broke through Petersburg's defenses. Lee sent a message to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, urging him to evacuate Richmond. The next day, Union soldiers entered the capital, not in triumph, but in awe. The city was smoldering. Fires set by retreating Confederates had gotten out of control. Black residents lined the streets, singing and cheering the bluecoats. They saw it not just as a military victory, but the promise of freedom finally arriving. Lee fled west, hoping to regroup with remnants of Confederate forces in North Carolina. It was a desperate, fading hope. Union cavalry and infantry raced to cut him off. By April 6th, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, nearly a quarter of Lee's army was captured or killed. His men were starving, surviving on handfuls of cornmeal, sleeping in the cold. Horses collapsed in their harnesses. "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant," Lee said quietly. The end had come. On the morning of April 9th, 1865, Lee rode through the fog to the village of Appomattox courthouse. He wore his finest uniform, silver sword at his side. It wasn't vanity, it was dignity. He wanted his men and the Union to see that even in surrender, there was still honor. Grant, by contrast, arrived in a dusty field coat, muddy boots, unaware he'd be posing for history. The two generals met inside the home of Wilmer McLean, a civilian whose previous house had been the site of the war's first major battle, a strange, almost poetic circle closing. The conversation was quiet, respectful. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate officers could keep their swords and horses. Men would not be imprisoned or tried for treason. When Lee mentioned that his men were starving, Grant immediately arranged for food to be delivered. About 25,000 rations were sent. Hardtack, bacon, coffee. It wasn't just a gesture. It was the beginning of a fragile healing. One Confederate soldier later wrote, "It was like the shadow of death had passed over us, and the sunlight broke through." Still, many wept openly as they stacked their weapons and furled the flags they'd carried into years of fire and smoke. That moment, the formal surrender at Appomattox, didn't end every battle. Some Confederate units held out for weeks, not yet aware or not yet willing to believe it was truly over. But the symbolic weight of Lee's surrender shattered the spine of the rebellion. The war, after 4 years, more than 600,000 deaths, and untold devastation, was finished. In Washington, bells rang out. People poured into the streets, laughing, crying, hugging strangers. Abraham Lincoln walked through the crowds quietly. He had visited the smoking ruins of Richmond just days earlier, a lone figure in a black coat, moving slowly through the ashes of a war he had never wanted. "Thank God I have lived to see this," one black man cried out as Lincoln passed. The president tipped his hat, tears in his eyes. Yet, even in victory, there was weariness. The Union had held, but the cost was nearly unbearable. Families torn apart, landscapes scarred, generations forever changed. And the question remained, what now? I often think about that moment between Lee and Grant, two men shaped by war, facing each other in silence. Not enemies, not quite allies, but witnesses to the same terrible story. They didn't argue, didn't accuse. They just ended it. There's something haunting about that stillness. After years of battle cries, drums, gunfire, it ended in a quiet room with two tired men and a few sheets of paper. And it makes you wonder, how many wars could end that way if pride didn't stand in the way of peace? The fragile calm that settled over the nation in the days following Appomattox was shattered in a way no one could have foreseen. It was April 14th, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor with fierce Confederate sympathies, stepped into Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The air that evening was thick with the exhaustion and tentative hope of a country emerging from years of bloodshed. Booth's plan was precise, yet steeped in desperation. He sought not just to kill a man, but to ignite chaos, to fracture the fragile peace before it could take hold. Booth slipped into the presidential box during the performance of Our American Cousin and fired a single pistol shot into President Abraham Lincoln's head. The sound, sharp and shocking, echoed through the theater, followed by a stunned silence, and then a frantic scramble. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he lingered through the night, slipping away in the early hours of April 15th. His final breaths marked the death of a leader who had borne the weight of a fractured nation for 4 long years. What struck me, reflecting on this moment, is how Booth's act was as much symbolic as it was violent. Lincoln had come to embody the Union's survival and a promise of reunification. Killing him was an attempt to rip apart the fragile threads holding the country together. Booth, a fervent believer in the Confederate cause, declared afterward that he had done what I could for the South. But what followed was anything but the restoration he envisioned. Booth was not alone in this dark plan. He was part of a wider conspiracy that aimed to decapitate the Union government. The assassination plot also targeted Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, hoping to throw the government into chaos. Seward survived a brutal attack, and Johnson's would-be assassin lost his nerve. But the fear, the suspicion, and the sorrow spread like wildfire. The manhunt for Booth became one of the largest and most intense in American history. For nearly 2 weeks, the nation's eyes searched the countryside, forests, and small towns of Maryland and Virginia. Booth, injured by a broken leg from his leap onto the stage after the shooting, was eventually tracked down to a tobacco barn on a farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Surrounded by Union soldiers, he refused to surrender and was fatally shot on April 26th. His death closed a tragic chapter, but opened countless wounds in a nation still struggling to find its footing. Across the country, the reaction to Lincoln's assassination was one of profound grief and stunned disbelief. Cities draped in mourning, flags flown at half-mast, and vigils filled streets from Boston to San Francisco. Lincoln's funeral procession stretched for miles, with thousands lining the streets to pay their respects. What I find especially moving are the personal stories from those who lived through it. The shopkeepers, soldiers, freed slaves, and women who saw in Lincoln not just a president, but a symbol of hope and endurance. Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist and orator, spoke with deep sorrow yet fierce resolve. He described Lincoln as the white man's president, who became the black man's liberator. Douglass believed that Lincoln's vision of a reunited nation included the promise of freedom for millions who had been enslaved, a promise now entrusted to a grieving and uncertain public. Yet, with Lincoln gone, the country's path forward became clouded with uncertainty. Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency, faced a Herculean task. He was a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, but his views on Reconstruction and the rights of freed slaves would soon prove deeply contentious. The hope for a smooth and just peace faded as political battles intensified, and the divisions that had fueled the war threatened to ignite anew. This moment in history, filled with grief and upheaval, reminds me of how fragile peace can be. The end of violence does not always mean the end of conflict, and the loss of a single figure, no matter how great, can ripple across generations. Lincoln's death became a powerful symbol of a nation's struggle, not just to survive but to define what it truly meant to be united. In the quiet aftermath of those days, as Washington grappled with the shock, the country prepared for the difficult work ahead. The war had ended, but the real challenge of rebuilding a fractured nation was just beginning. This was a turning point, where hope and pain walked hand in hand, and the promise of a new America lay in the hands of those willing to shape it. Lincoln's legacy, though violently interrupted, cast a long shadow over the years that followed. His vision for the country, complicated and imperfect, inspired both progress and resistance. And as we continue this story, it becomes clear that the war's end was not a neat conclusion, but the start of another chapter, a chapter filled with both promise and peril. This moment, full of raw human emotion and uncertain futures, is where the true story of Reconstruction begins. It is a story of hope and struggle, of ideals challenged and sometimes broken. But it is also a story of people, ordinary and extraordinary, who fought to redefine freedom and justice in a nation forever changed. The fragile hopes that flickered with the end of the war soon met the harsh winds of a deeply divided nation, struggling to find its footing once more. Reconstruction, a word heavy with promise and burden, began as an effort to mend the shattered fabric of the United States, stitching together a union forever altered by 4 years of brutal conflict. Yet the path to healing was neither straight nor gentle. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December of 1865, formally abolished slavery, an undeniable legal milestone. Freedom, however, was a complex and multifaceted journey that extended far beyond the simple end of chains. For millions of formerly enslaved people, the question became how to live, work, and claim a place in a society that had long denied their humanity. Freedmen's Bureau agents, often overwhelmed and underfunded, stepped in to provide some assistance: food, education, and legal aid. But their reach was limited, and their mission met with increasing hostility. As the nation wrestled with these new realities, the 14th Amendment arrived in 1868, promising citizenship and equal protection under the law to all born or naturalized in the United States. This constitutional safeguard aimed to secure civil rights, but it also sowed the seeds of fierce resistance in the South. White Southern Democrats, many determined to restore their antebellum social order, responded with laws known as Black Codes, restrictive measures designed to control the labor and behavior of African Americans, limiting their freedoms and opportunities. Violence quickly followed the ink on these laws. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866 by former Confederate soldiers, rose from the shadows with terrifying speed. Cloaked in white and armed with intimidation, they spread fear across the South, targeting black communities, unionists, and anyone who dared support Reconstruction. Their reign of terror was not random, but a calculated effort to undermine the political and social gains African Americans had begun to claim. It was, as one survivor later recalled in an interview, a war after the war, fought in silence in shadows. Amid this turmoil, the political landscape shifted dramatically. President Andrew Johnson, who assumed office after Lincoln's assassination, often clashed with the radical Republicans in Congress, who sought more stringent protections for freed people and harsher measures against the former Confederacy. Johnson's leniency toward the South and frequent vetoes of civil rights legislation created an impasse, slowing the progress of Reconstruction and emboldening white supremacist factions. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the South into military districts to enforce new laws and safeguard voting rights for black men. This federal intervention briefly allowed African Americans to vote, hold office, and participate in government like never before. Some African Americans were elected to local and state positions, a testament to resilience and hope. Yet, these victories were precarious, often overshadowed by threats and acts of terror. One such story comes from a freedman named Robert Smalls, a former enslaved sailor who commandeered a Confederate ship to freedom during the war, and later became a US congressman. He spoke of the era with cautious optimism, but also profound sadness. We have won a battle, but the war for our souls and dignity continues. This era, often remembered as a time of progress, was deeply marked by the tensions of a society unwilling to fully embrace change. White Southerners' efforts to restore their pre-war privileges were met with federal resistance, but also exhaustion from prolonged conflict and political infighting. By the mid-1870s, support for Reconstruction waned in the North, and federal troops gradually withdrew, leaving African Americans exposed once more. The Compromise of 1877, an informal agreement that resolved the disputed 1876 presidential election, effectively ended Reconstruction. In exchange for Republican Rutherford B. Hayes taking office, federal troops were removed from the South, abandoning many of the protections that had briefly held back the tide of segregation and disenfranchisement. What followed was the era of Jim Crow laws, a system of legalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement that would persist for nearly a century. The hopes kindled in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War dimmed under the weight of discrimination, violence, and systemic oppression. Yet, the Reconstruction period remains a testament to the determination of those who fought for equality, even when the odds were stacked heavily against them. As I reflect on this chapter of history, I am struck by the complexity of progress, the way hope can coexist with hardship, and how the echoes of this difficult era continue to resonate today. The voices of freedmen, politicians, and ordinary citizens remind us that freedom is never a gift, but a continuous struggle, fragile and fiercely guarded. Listening to testimonies from freed people recorded in the 20th century, many express mixed feelings: relief for the end of slavery, pride in their political achievements, but also sorrow for the violence and betrayal that followed. One woman, Sarah Morgan, said in an interview, "We tasted freedom like sweet water, but the bitter cup came soon after." It's a story not just of laws and battles, but of human endurance, frailty, and the pursuit of dignity in the face of relentless adversity. And it invites us to consider how history shapes not only nations, but the lives of individuals, whose stories are often lost in grand narratives. The Reconstruction era was a time when America stood at a crossroads, struggling to define what freedom truly meant, and whether a nation so deeply scarred could heal and grow stronger. The answers were not simple, and the scars left behind would take generations to confront. In that silence between the voices of history, we find both caution and hope, a reminder that progress is never guaranteed, but always worth striving for, even in the darkest hours. If you found yourself reflecting on these stories tonight, perhaps you've sensed the enduring tension between change and resistance, freedom and fear, that continues to shape the world we live in today. It's a story that lingers quietly beneath the surface of modern America, waiting for us to listen closely and remember. The echoes of the Civil War stretch far beyond the battlefields of the 1860s, weaving into the very fabric of modern America. When we look closely at the issues that still stir debate today, questions of race, identity, and governance, it becomes clear that the conflict was never truly confined to the past. Instead, it left behind a legacy that continues to shape, challenge, and sometimes divide the nation. One of the most visible reminders of this legacy lies in the monuments and memorials scattered across the country, particularly in the South. These statues and plaques, often erected decades after the war, tell a story not only of remembrance but of contested memory. Historians like Dr. Heather Cox Richardson have pointed out how many Confederate monuments were not simply tributes to history, but statements of power erected during times when African Americans were pushing for civil rights, such as during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights Movement. They were symbols meant to reinforce social hierarchies and resist change. This tension over how history is remembered and honored can be seen in contemporary debates over Confederate flags flying at state capitals, or the removal of statues from public spaces. For many, these symbols represent a painful reminder of oppression and division. For others, they are part of a complex heritage, a legacy of regional identity. As historian Eric Foner notes, the struggle over memory is a struggle over the future of the nation. It is a conversation that continues to unfold in school textbooks, political speeches, and everyday discussions. Beyond monuments, the war's aftershocks ripple through ongoing issues of racial inequality and civil rights. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments lay the legal foundation for freedom and equality, but the promise of those rights has often gone unfulfilled. The long shadow of segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic racism stretches into modern institutions, affecting education, housing, voting rights, and criminal justice. As legal scholar Michelle Alexander highlights, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow has evolved into new forms, such as mass incarceration, creating a cycle that echoes the injustices of the past. Yet, amid these challenges, the Civil War also ignited a conversation about citizenship and democracy that is still vibrant today. The idea that a nation could be rebuilt on principles of equality and unity, even after such profound conflict, remains a powerful aspiration. In interviews with descendants of both Union and Confederate soldiers, many express a complicated pride, acknowledging the pain of their ancestors while hoping for reconciliation and understanding. Consider the words of historian James McPherson, who said, "The Civil War was a tragic but necessary upheaval, a violent reckoning with the contradictions of a nation founded on liberty, yet built on slavery. This reckoning continues, sometimes painfully, as America wrestles with its ideals and realities." In recent years, movements for racial justice, such as Black Lives Matter, have brought renewed attention to these historical wounds. Protests and discussions about systemic inequality often trace their roots back to the unresolved questions left by the Civil War and Reconstruction. In this way, history is not just something we study, but something we live, as communities seek to create a more just and inclusive future. At the same time, debates over states' rights and federal power, a core tension during the war, still appear in modern political discourse. Whether it is arguments over healthcare, education policy, or environmental regulation, the balance of authority between local and national governments reflects issues that once threatened to tear the country apart. Listening to voices from across the spectrum, historians, activists, politicians, and everyday citizens, reveals a nation still in dialogue with its past. The Civil War was not simply a battle won or lost. It was a transformative moment that reshaped what it means to be American. As the historian David Blight has observed, how a nation remembers its past tells us as much about its present as its history. Reflecting on all this, I find it both humbling and hopeful. Humbling because the wounds of the past are deep and complex, and healing takes time, patience, and honest reckoning. Hopeful because the very fact that we continue to talk, learn, and question is a sign of a living democracy, one that seeks to understand its history to build a better tomorrow. So, as we close this long journey through the American Civil War, I encourage you to carry with you not only the facts and dates, but the human stories beneath them. The courage, the pain, the resilience. These are the threads that connect us across generations and remind us that history is not just about what happened, but about who we are and who we want to become. Thank you for joining me on this quiet exploration. Until our next late-night story, may you find rest in the gentle unfolding of time. And if you found value in this journey, a small click of like or subscribe would be deeply appreciated. Good night and take care.